A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. I am reminding you, brothers and sisters, of the gospel I preached to you, which you indeed received, and in which you also stand. Through it you are also being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I handed on to you, as of first importance, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. After that, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one born abnormally, he appeared to me. For I am the least of the apostles, not fit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me has not been ineffective. Indeed, I have toiled harder than all of them, not I, however, but the grace of God that is with me. So therefore, whether it be I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, brothers, we've survived another visitation. Chris and Charlie still might be with us, but you can go ahead and loosen your cinctures. Some of you can put back on your Birkenstocks. Jude, you don't have to clean your room for another year. So, but perhaps the good part of the visitation, the blessing of it, is that it helps us to take a step back from our daily occurrences and our busy schedules. And it helps us to stop and reflect and ask, how is it that I'm doing in my vocation as a Dominican? It's this reflecting with intentionality that brings us back to the heart of our vocations. When I think back over the several preachings that I've heard over the last couple weekends, it seems to me that a central theme, maybe a common focus of our preaching, really focuses on perfection, or perhaps the lack thereof perfection. We focused on our failures and our unworthiness. The readings today from 1 Corinthians, the ones at Mass from Gospel of Luke, they really show us that we're in good company. Paul proclaims his lowliness and his unworthiness to preach the gospel, but more explicitly, he proclaims the efficaciousness of God's grace working through him, his sinfulness, his pride working through his weaknesses. It was God's grace that saved Paul from this life of hatred and enabled him really to serve God. We too, like Paul, have been given Christ's grace to preach. We also heard at Mass today the story of Jesus calling Peter and the other apostles. After that long night of fishing, Jesus commanded Peter to go back out and to lower his nets for a catch. In amazement at God's power, at the abundance of the catch that was brought in, the boat filled to the brim with fish, Peter was overcome with his own unworthiness. "Depart from me, Lord," Peter said, "for I am a sinful man." But if Peter had simply stopped there, without accepting Christ's mercy and his grace, our story today would probably be very different. But Peter, too, was able to overcome this sense of weakness and unworthiness, to accept the invitation of Christ, to follow him more closely, and to preach. So when I look at our vocation as Dominicans, we hear again our call from God to preach the gospel. Paul reminds the Corinthian community of the good news that was preached to them, that Christ died for our sins, that he was buried, that he rose on the third day, that he appeared to Peter and the apostles, and later to 500 more. This is the fullness of the gospel that we're called to preach, without leaving any part of it open, or without leaving any part of it out. So often in my own life, though, I find that I focus on my own unworthiness and my sins, that I tend to relive over and over again the death of Christ, his passion, without ever accepting the grace of God to reach the resurrection. How is it then in my own life that I can share the good news of Christ conquering sin and death if it's not what my lived experience is? We then are called to both live and to preach the fullness of the gospel by acknowledging, yes, our own unworthiness, but also through our receptivity to accept Christ's grace that enables us to live out this resurrection. It's through living out Christ's resurrection in our daily lives, through the growth of holiness and in virtue, that we are enabled to be better preachers and witnesses to the gospel, which Paul was reminding the Corinthians of. As we approach Lent this week, Martin told us it was about 57,000 minutes or something like that of Lent coming up. What better way to come to terms with our own unworthiness, our own imperfections, than by focusing our hearts on living this resurrection? The silence, the penance, the other Lenten practices that we might take on ourselves or as a community. During these 40 days, they can be aids for us to finding the heart of our Dominican vocations. They can help us root ourselves in the humility to accept God's grace to go out in order to preach.